The Cold War was not a traditional conflict fought on defined battlefields, but a global, existential struggle waged in the shadows. A relentless ideological and technological contest between two mutually antagonistic systems, American liberal democracy and Soviet totalitarian communism. The period immediately following World War II, a time that should have been marked by global reconstruction and peace, was instead defined by the rapid emergence of this new, terrifying schism. The end of the war left a power vacuum in Europe and Asia, which the United States and the Soviet Union immediately sought to fill, transforming former allies into mortal rivals. The fundamental disagreement centered on the shape of the post-war world. For the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, security meant dominating Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone of satellite states shielded by an Iron Curtain, a phrase famously coined by Winston Churchill. For the United States, this expansion represented the aggressive spread of an oppressive ideology that threatened the democratic foundations of Western civilization. This ideological confrontation quickly metastasized into a massive geopolitical and military buildup. Both sides poured immense resources into developing military technology, initiating a furious arms race. The Soviet detonation of an atomic device in 1949 eliminated America's nuclear monopoly, ushering in the concept of nuclear parity. This balance of power, terrifyingly, meant that any direct, open conflict between the two giants would escalate immediately and inevitably into a global nuclear exchange, leading to the destruction of both combatants and potentially civilization itself. This reality, that a conventional war was unwinnable and catastrophic, forced the conflict entirely into the realm of espionage, proxy wars, and covert operations. The intelligence community, specifically the American Central Intelligence Agency and the Soviet Committee for State Security, or KGB, became the primary armies of the Cold War. Their mission was not to fight on the battlefield, but to gather secrets, undermine the enemy's stability, and prevent any unilateral strategic advantage that might tempt the other side into a devastating first strike. These shadow wars, fought through espionage, sabotage, psychological warfare, and political subversion, carried their own immense, hidden risks. Every covert operation, every attempt to penetrate the enemy's defenses, was a potential trigger point, a miscalculation that could be misinterpreted as a prelude to invasion, a technological leap that threatened parity, or a humiliation that demanded military reprisal. The stakes of this shadow war were the highest in human history, the survival of the world. The operations were conceived in desperation and executed with extreme secrecy, pushing the boundaries of legal, ethical, and military risk. They were the mechanisms by which the two superpowers constantly probed each other's weaknesses, always teetering on the razor's edge of an open nuclear confrontation. Understanding the sheer madness of some of these spy operations requires a full appreciation of this backdrop. A world where an intelligence failure in a distant corner of the globe could, in a matter of hours, be mistaken for an act of war, launching the planet toward an atomic Armageddon neither side truly wanted, but both were perpetually prepared to execute. The operations we will examine were the most daring, the most ridiculous, and the most frighteningly close calls in this decades-long war fought in the dark.
The defining strategic reality of the Cold War was the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This concept, chilling in its simplicity, provided the necessary, if terrifying, stability that prevented the conflict from turning hot. MAD was based on the premise that both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear firepower, delivered via sophisticated systems like intercontinental ballistic missiles and strategic bomber fleets, to completely destroy the other, even after absorbing a surprise first strike. The logic was inescapable. Initiating a nuclear war was tantamount to national suicide. This guaranteed catastrophe elevated every single military and intelligence action to a level of existential risk. Since total war was unthinkable, the competition shifted entirely to the intelligence arena, creating the spy game. The central goal of every covert operation was no longer to achieve military victory, but to maintain or disrupt the delicate nuclear balance. The intelligence agencies were tasked with two critical, contradictory objectives. First, to prevent technological surprise. The fear was that the enemy might secretly develop a breakthrough, a perfect missile defense, a silent submarine, or a superweapon that could neutralize the opponent's retaliatory capacity, thus undermining MAD and enabling a disarming first strike. Operations like the U-2 flights were directly aimed at discovering the size and sophistication of the Soviet missile program to ensure the US could maintain its deterrent force. Second, to project strength and resolve without triggering a direct response. This involved a delicate dance of covert operations designed to gain information or destabilize the enemy's sphere of influence without presenting a clear, undeniable casus belli, a reason for war. The intelligence agency became the tool for limited engagement, a way to fight the enemy without committing the standing military. This often required blurring the line between espionage and acts of war, such as infiltrating enemy territory, assassinating foreign leaders, or conducting massive illegal surveillance operations. The high-stakes environment ensured that every operation was subject to extreme levels of risk assessment. A captured spy, a downed plane, or a discovered sabotage attempt could be seen not as a simple intelligence loss, but as a deliberate act of aggression capable of triggering a full-scale military mobilization. For instance, the discovery of American reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory led to immediate aggressive military posturing by Moscow. The stakes were further amplified by the inherent problem of misinterpretation and miscalculation. In the high-stress, low-trust environment of the Cold War, a perfectly routine military exercise or a failed spy gadget could be misinterpreted by the other side's command structure as the prelude to a nuclear attack. The spy game was therefore a constant gamble. The intelligence agencies, tasked with ensuring national survival, were simultaneously the single most likely source of the trigger that could end the world. The operations we are about to explore were the moments when that gambler's hand was played too aggressively, revealing just how close the world came to a misunderstanding that could have fulfilled the terrifying promise of mutually assured destruction. The spy operations were a necessary evil, yet in their audaciousness and reach, they almost delivered the apocalypse they were designed to prevent.
The story of Project Azorian, one of the most audacious and technologically complex covert operations ever conceived, begins with a silent, catastrophic event deep beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. In the early spring of 1968, the Soviet Navy suffered a devastating loss. The K-129, a heavily armed diesel-electric ballistic missile submarine carrying 3 nuclear-tipped missiles, sank inexplicably approximately 1,560 miles northwest of Oahu, Hawaii. The exact circumstances of the loss remain a matter of conjecture, ranging from an internal explosion to a collision with a submerged American vessel, but the immediate consequence was clear. a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was resting on the seabed, nearly 3 miles beneath the surface. For the Soviet Union, the loss was a national tragedy and a military disaster they desperately tried to conceal. For the United States intelligence community, the sunken K-129 presented an unprecedented and irresistible target, a potential intelligence coup that promised access to some of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets. The primary intelligence prize was the Soviet nuclear missile technology. Retrieving the submarine would give the Americans access to the design, construction, and coding of the Soviet R-13 ballistic missiles, allowing them to understand the missile's range, warhead specifications, and launch mechanisms. This information was vital for maintaining the balance of MAD and for designing effective defensive measures. The secondary, but equally important prize was the submarine's cryptographic and communications equipment. Access to the Soviet codebooks, cipher machines, and intelligence documentation would provide the U.S. with an unparalleled window into Soviet naval strategy and communication methods, potentially compromising their entire command and control structure. This intelligence gain would be transformative, offering a monumental advantage in the ongoing shadow war. The U.S. Navy, through its vast and sophisticated underwater acoustic surveillance system known as SOUS, Sound Surveillance System, was able to pinpoint the exact location of the sinking. The fragments of sonic data suggested a massive implosion event, and after months of dedicated analysis, the coordinates of the K-129's final resting place, a staggering 16,000 feet deep in the abyssal plain, were confirmed. The technical challenge was extraordinary. No nation had ever attempted to retrieve an object of such size and weight from such extreme depths. The operation was classified under the codename Project Azorian, and its scope immediately elevated it beyond a standard military mission into a realm of pure technological espionage fantasy. The entire operation had to be conducted under a meticulously crafted cover story to prevent the Soviet Union from discovering that the Americans knew the location of their lost submarine. Any hint of the operation would not only trigger a massive Soviet recovery effort, but would also be construed as an act of blatant military provocation and theft of sovereign military hardware, an event that could easily escalate the already tense Cold War into an international crisis. The audacious decision to proceed with the recovery, despite the immense technological risk and the potential for a catastrophic diplomatic incident, set the stage for one of the craziest and most expensive spy operations in history. The intelligence reward was too great to ignore, justifying a covert salvage effort that would require building an entirely new class of vessel and weaving an elaborate multi-million-dollar corporate illusion.
Project Azorian was the ultimate Cold War gamble, a technical marvel built on a mountain of deception. To execute the retrieval of the Soviet K-129 submarine from a depth of over 3 miles, the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, was forced to conceive an almost unbelievable cover story, one that required the creation of an entirely new vessel and the recruitment of one of America's most eccentric and famous billionaires, Howard Hughes. The cover story was as outlandish as the mission itself. The CIA commissioned the construction of a massive, unique deep-sea salvage ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer. To explain the purpose of this colossal, technologically advanced vessel, the CIA propagated the elaborate, highly plausible fiction that the ship was a purely commercial vessel owned by Howard Hughes's conglomerate, tasked with mining the deep ocean floor for manganese nodules, valuable minerals believed to be abundant on the abyssal plains.
The involvement of Hughes, known for his obsession with large-scale projects and his reclusiveness, provided the perfect, unchallenged explanation for the ship's strange design and extreme secrecy. The Glomar Explorer was a masterpiece of covert engineering, designed specifically for the K-129 operation. Its most critical hidden feature was a massive, retractable moon pool, a large opening in the center of the ship's hull that could be opened to the sea below. This moon pool allowed the recovery apparatus to be lowered and operated entirely out of sight, protecting the operation from passing Soviet surveillance vessels. The recovery mechanism itself was a colossal, custom-built mechanical claw known as the Clementine, designed to grasp and lift the massive weight of the sunken submarine through miles of dark ocean. The operation commenced in the summer of 1974. The Glomar Explorer sailed to the designated coordinates and began the slow, torturous process of lifting the wreckage. The CIA anticipated that the Soviets would be monitoring the area, so a Soviet intelligence ship, the Chazma, was constantly present, circling the Glomar Explorer, observing its strange, slow movements. The success of the manganese mining cover story was paramount. The CIA personnel, disguised as civilian contractors, maintained the elaborate charade, while beneath the massive hull, the mechanical claw struggled to lift the immense wreck. Despite the monumental engineering effort, the mission was only a partial success. As the K-129's hull was being raised, a catastrophic structural failure occurred. The submarine, fractured and weakened by the implosion and years on the ocean floor, broke apart. Only the forward third of the submarine was recovered. Although the full recovery failed, the recovered section contained 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes, vital cryptographic machines, and the bodies of 6 Soviet crew members. The intelligence gain was significant, providing the U.S. with invaluable insights into Soviet naval technology. However, the operation's cover was ultimately blown in 1975 when internal CIA documents were leaked to the media, leading to worldwide headlines. The public exposure of Project Azorian triggered a major diplomatic scandal. The Soviet Union, having monitored the Glomar Explorer for weeks, immediately realized the full scope of the audacious theft. While the Soviets protested vehemently, the fact that the operation was carried out by the CIA under a corporate cover and the evidence was already secured prevented a full-scale military confrontation. Project Azorian remains a testament to the extremes of Cold War espionage, a billion-dollar deep-sea heist that required technological ingenuity, the facade of a reclusive billionaire, and a willingness to risk an international incident that came perilously close to inciting a naval conflict in the Pacific.
The operational use of the U-2 Dragon Lady high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft represents one of the most critical and high-stakes chapters in the technological spy war designed to pierce the Soviet Union's deepest secrets at a time when the strategic balance was profoundly uncertain. The U-2 was born out of a desperate need to accurately assess the Soviet threat, particularly their progress in developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union was aggressively promoting its technological prowess, leading to a deep anxiety in the United States, often referred to as the missile gap. The fear that the Soviets had surpassed American missile capability and could launch a devastating, disarming first strike. The U-2 was the technological answer to this intelligence deficiency. Developed covertly by the Lockheed Skunk Works, the U-2 was a single-seat jet designed to fly at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, well above the ceiling of any known Soviet interceptor aircraft or anti-aircraft missile of the time. This incredible altitude was the U-2's defining feature and its primary defense. From this vantage point, the plane could photograph immense swaths of Soviet territory with unprecedented clarity using its massive, specialized camera system. The U-2's primary mission was to fly deep into Soviet airspace to identify and map strategic military installations, missile launch sites, airfields, and, critically, ICBM production and deployment facilities. President Dwight D. Eisenhower personally authorized these high-risk overflights, justifying the potential for a diplomatic incident by arguing that the intelligence gained was essential to national survival and maintaining the nuclear deterrent under the MAD doctrine. The U-2 flights were extraordinarily successful in their early years. The intelligence gathered provided irrefutable proof that the highly touted Soviet missile program was, in fact, far behind American estimates. The U-2 imagery demonstrated that the missile gap was largely a Soviet propaganda effort, correcting faulty intelligence and preventing potentially disastrous miscalculations by the U.S. military and government. However, the operational risks were always clear. The Soviet Union viewed the overflights as a blatant violation of their sovereign airspace and a clear act of aggression. While they initially lacked the technology to shoot down the U-2, Soviet air defenses were continually being upgraded, and it was only a matter of time before the technological edge disappeared. The U.S. government was fully aware that a captured or downed U-2 pilot would expose the espionage program, creating a massive international incident and potentially leading to a military confrontation. The success of the U-2 missions gave the U.S. invaluable intelligence, but it also fostered a dangerous sense of invulnerability within the intelligence community. The continued authorization of the flights, even as Soviet missile technology improved, was a colossal gamble rooted in the belief that the strategic advantage gained was worth the immense risk of a global conflict. This gamble reached its catastrophic climax on May 1, 1960, when the seemingly impregnable U-2 was finally brought down, shattering the fragile diplomatic détente and revealing the true audacity of America's commitment to high-altitude espionage. The U-2, the technological marvel designed to prevent a war, became the very instrument that almost ignited the next great global conflict.
The fragile peace of the Cold War was dramatically shattered on May 1, 1960, when the Soviet Union finally achieved the technological feat it had spent years striving for, shooting down an American U-2 spy plane deep within its own airspace. The incident, centered on the capture of pilot Francis Gary Powers, immediately escalated from a routine intelligence loss into a major international crisis, crippling diplomatic efforts and bringing the two superpowers to a dangerous standstill. Powers was flying a mission over the central Soviet Union when his aircraft was struck by a Soviet SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile, SAM, a newly deployed weapon that had finally neutralized the U-2's altitude advantage. Against standing orders to destroy the plane and himself to prevent capture, Powers ejected and survived the impact, falling into Soviet hands. The Soviet leadership, under Premier Nikita Khrushchev, initially concealed the capture of the pilot and the intact aircraft. The U.S. government, believing Powers had perished and his aircraft had been completely destroyed, executed a pre-planned, elaborate cover story. NASA quickly issued a press release claiming that a weather research aircraft had gone missing over Turkey after the pilot reported oxygen trouble. The deception was intended to deny any espionage mission and mitigate the political fallout. Khrushchev then played his masterful hand.
Days after the US denial, he publicly revealed that the Soviet Union had not only recovered the wreckage of the spy plane, complete with its specialized reconnaissance camera, but had also captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive. This dramatic revelation exposed the US government's entire cover story as a deliberate lie, causing immense international embarrassment for President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The incident occurred just days before a crucial four-power Paris summit, a meeting intended to ease Cold War tensions and discuss arms control and the future of Berlin. Khrushchev arrived at the summit demanding a formal apology from the US for the violation of Soviet sovereignty and the blatant act of espionage. Eisenhower, caught between political necessity and the humiliation of admitting to a lie, refused to issue the full apology demanded. The collapse of the Paris summit was immediate and total. Khrushchev, infuriated and emboldened, withdrew from the summit, effectively ending the period of tentative détente and plunging US-Soviet relations back into a deep freeze. The incident had devastating geopolitical consequences. It severely undermined Eisenhower's credibility on the world stage, and the hardline stance taken by the Soviets demonstrated their zero-tolerance policy for direct, verifiable acts of aggression. The U-2 incident was far more than a loss of intelligence. It was a political earthquake that exposed the aggressive undercurrent of the Shadow War. It proved that the Soviet Union would not hesitate to retaliate against foreign espionage, and that the risks of high-altitude spy flights had finally outweighed the intelligence gains. The capture of one pilot and the debris of one plane became the catalyst that torpedoed the best chance for arms control in years, pushing the two superpowers further down the path toward military confrontation, a stark illustration of how a covert intelligence operation can directly trigger a major diplomatic crisis with military implications.
Berlin, deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany, stood as the singular, most sensitive flashpoint of the entire Cold War. An island of Western freedom surrounded by the Iron Curtain. For the intelligence community, this unique geographical and political status made Berlin the undisputed capital of spies and the center of the Shadow War. The city's post-war division into four sectors, American, British, French, and Soviet, created a seam of unparalleled access and vulnerability. The relative ease with which citizens could cross between the Western sectors, West Berlin, and the Soviet sector, East Berlin, prior to the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, created a constant chaotic flow of people, information, and, critically, intelligence assets. For the West, West Berlin was a vital listening post, a secure hub from which surveillance and espionage operations could be launched directly into the heart of the Soviet zone and East Germany. For the Soviet Union, the constant Western presence was an immense security headache, a continuous source of Western psychological warfare, and a conduit for the flight of hundreds of thousands of East German citizens to the West. The intelligence environment was defined by constant aggressive counterintelligence efforts. The Soviet KGB and the East German Ministry for State Security, or Stasi, maintained a massive presence, attempting to identify and neutralize Western agents while simultaneously running their own networks of informants and moles within the Western sectors. This created a climate of profound paranoia and mistrust, where virtually every foreign national or high-level official was considered a potential spy. The intelligence focus for both sides in Berlin was intense and highly strategic. For the Soviets, the goal was to eliminate the Western foothold and stop the embarrassing drain of skilled citizens.
For the Americans and British, the primary objective was to penetrate the Soviet military headquarters in East Berlin and the critical East German communication lines that linked Soviet forces in Germany to Moscow. Understanding the Soviet military's intentions, their troop movements, and their command and control capabilities was considered essential to preventing a surprise invasion of Western Europe. This imperative, the need to know the Soviets' plans, provided the irresistible context for one of the Cold War's most audacious engineering feats, Operation Gold. The potential intelligence gain, a direct, unfiltered feed of Soviet military communication, was deemed worth the monumental risk. The operational concept was born out of the unique vulnerability of the divided city, the communications infrastructure, specifically the critical telephone lines used by the Soviet military, ran directly beneath the streets of Berlin, many of them close to the western sector. To access these critical secrets, the Western intelligence agencies had to physically penetrate the earth beneath the Iron Curtain. The successful execution of Operation Gold would mean access to vital secrets. Its discovery, however, would be an act of war, a clear, undeniable breach of sovereignty, and an attack on Soviet military communications, carrying the high risk of a retaliatory military action that could involve sealing off West Berlin entirely and plunging Europe into a major conflict.
Operation Gold, codenamed Operation Stopwatch by the Americans and Operation Regency by the British, was a collaborative effort between the CIA and the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, to construct a massive, sophisticated tunnel underneath East Berlin to tap into the main communication cables used by the Soviet military headquarters. It was an act of pure technological defiance and massive espionage theft that ultimately carried a diplomatic and political price. The operation commenced in 1953, with construction beginning from a warehouse situated in the American sector of Berlin, right next to the border. Over the course of a year, engineers worked in extreme secrecy, digging a 1,476-foot-long tunnel that burrowed 20 feet beneath the earth and extended directly into the Soviet sector. The engineering required was immense, involving shoring up the soft Berlin soil and ensuring that the work, which included the use of power tools and heavy ventilation, remained completely silent and undetected by the Soviet guards positioned just yards away. The tunnel successfully reached the three major communication cables, one American to East German civilian line, and two critical Soviet military lines. The intelligence teams installed elaborate tapping equipment, and for the next 11 months, Operation Gold was a phenomenal success. The tunnel yielded an immense treasure trove of Soviet and East German communication. Over 400,000 conversations were recorded, transcribed, and analyzed. The information provided crucial insights into the organization, disposition, and political intentions of the Soviet military forces in East Germany, including details about their troop movements, internal political machinations, and, importantly, confirmed the limited nature of their missile capabilities at the time. The intelligence helped solidify the Western understanding of Soviet strategic weakness. However, the entire operation, from its conception to its completion, was compromised from the beginning. Unbeknownst to the CIA and MI6, the KGB had an exceptionally placed mole within the British intelligence service, George Blake, a high-ranking double agent working for the Soviets. Blake, who was intimately involved in the planning of the operation, informed the KGB about the tunnel's existence, its purpose, and its exact location even before construction began.
The KGB leadership made the strategic decision not to immediately expose the tunnel. Instead, they allowed Operation Gold to proceed, turning it into a brilliant double bluff. They began feeding the West a stream of carefully curated disinformation and non-essential chatter over the compromised lines, subtly manipulating Western intelligence assessments while simultaneously protecting their truly critical communication channels. This strategy allowed the Soviets to not only protect their secret information, but also to identify all the Soviet and East German officials who were speaking too freely over the tapped lines. The KGB waited until April 1956 to discover the tunnel, staging a dramatic exposure of the underground espionage center for maximum propaganda value. The Soviets denounced the operation as a gangster-like act and a flagrant violation of international law. While the exposure was a profound embarrassment for the US and UK and a massive propaganda victory for the Soviets, the true danger was the potential military response. The intentional, direct attack on Soviet military communications was a severe provocation that could have easily led to a military blockade of Berlin. Fortunately, the Soviet leadership chose the propaganda victory over a military confrontation, likely because the operation had been compromised for so long that its discovery no longer posed a surprise military threat. Operation Gold remains a brilliant, costly, and ultimately frustrating operation. A technical triumph that was politically compromised, yielding secrets that were partly genuine and partly fabricated. A perfect microcosm of the paranoid, ambiguous nature of the Shadow War.
The rise of Fidel Castro and the establishment of a communist regime just 90 miles off the coast of Florida transformed the Cold War from a distant European confrontation into an immediate existential threat to the American homeland. Cuba, under Castro's charismatic and defiant leadership, became the central obsession of the U.S. intelligence community, leading to a series of increasingly reckless, bizarre, and ultimately disastrous covert operations aimed at destabilizing the Castro regime and ultimately facilitating his overthrow. Operation Mongoose encompassed a wide range of activities, from economic sabotage, such as spoiling the sugarcane harvest, to psychological warfare, including the distribution of anti-Castro propaganda. However, the most desperate and infamous component of the operation involved a series of concerted, outlandish plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. The belief was that Castro's charismatic hold on power was the only thing sustaining the communist government. His removal would, ostensibly, cause the regime to collapse. The assassination plots were born of a mixture of Cold War urgency and a kind of desperate, almost amateurish cloak-and-dagger ingenuity. The CIA worked closely with anti-Castro Cuban exiles and, shockingly, even utilized the services of American mafia figures who had lost their lucrative Cuban gambling and prostitution empires after the revolution. The plots themselves read like bad spy fiction, reflecting a terrifying lack of restraint and an intense, all-consuming focus on the single target. They involved attempts to poison Castro's cigars, contaminate his food with botulism, and even a ridiculous plan to impregnate his scuba diving suit with a fungus that would cause a debilitating skin disease. The common theme was to kill Castro without creating a traceable link back to the US government, thereby maintaining a fragile deniability. The immense political risk of these plots cannot be overstated. Had any of these attempts been successful, or had the US involvement been conclusively proven, the Soviet Union would have had a clear justification for aggressive military or retaliatory action. The failure of the US to remove Castro, coupled with the escalation of these covert operations, contributed directly to the most dangerous single moment of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro, feeling increasingly threatened by the US's overt and covert acts of aggression,
requested Soviet Premier Khrushchev to place nuclear missiles on Cuban soil for protection, setting the stage for global nuclear confrontation. Operation Mongoose, far from achieving its goal, ultimately backfired, acting as a massive, unintended catalyst for the Soviet military buildup in the Caribbean and demonstrating the extreme dangers of allowing intelligence agencies to engage in targeted political violence against sovereign heads of state.
The sheer absurdity of the Operation Mongoose assassination attempts against Fidel Castro stands as a stark testament to the desperate lengths the CIA was willing to go, demonstrating a frightening collapse of judgment driven by the intense political pressure to eliminate the communist threat in the Caribbean. These plots often involved ludicrous, movie-like concepts that repeatedly failed, but their execution brought the US perilously close to inciting a direct military conflict with the Soviet Union. The CIA's fixation on Castro's known habits led to several signature farcical plots. One infamous scheme involved attempting to impregnate a box of his favorite cigars with a fast-acting, lethal poison. Another plot involved the use of a more theatrical, explosive device, a cigar designed to detonate with enough force to lethally injure him. Both attempts, however, failed to reach Castro. Another scheme exploited Castro's enthusiasm for scuba diving. The CIA devised a plan to present him with a gift, a wetsuit, that was secretly contaminated with a chemical and a fungus that would induce a debilitating skin disease. This was coupled with another plan to plant an exploding seashell device in an area where Castro was known to dive. These bizarre, high-effort plots were consistently foiled by practical failures, changes in Castro's habits, or the inefficiency of the operatives, a failure streak that earned the CIA considerable derision even within the US government. The plots also involved highly questionable alliances. The CIA's use of mafia figures like Santo Trafficante Jr. and Sam Giancana introduced a significant criminal element into the heart of a sensitive US foreign policy operation. The hope was that the mob, with its established network in pre-revolution Cuba, could more easily gain access to Castro's inner circle. This partnership was an ethical disaster and created immense security risks, exposing the CIA to potential blackmail and complicating the deniability of the operation. Beyond the assassinations, Operation Mongoose included plans for psychological warfare designed to discredit Castro and sow internal chaos. One of the wildest schemes involved attempting to make Castro's beard, his signature symbol of the revolution, fall out. The CIA planned to spray a thallium salt solution into his shoes or on his clothing at a public event, hoping the resulting loss of hair would destroy his image as a rugged, masculine leader. These repeated attempts at political subversion and targeted violence against a Soviet-allied head of state created an atmosphere of extreme hostility. The constant, aggressive covert pressure from the US confirmed Castro's worst fears, that the Americans were actively plotting his downfall and death. This was the direct, primary motivation that led both Castro and, crucially, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to conclude that the only way to deter further US aggression was to establish a massive, strategic military presence on the island. The culmination of Operation Mongoose's failures and provocations was the Soviet decision to secretly deploy intermediate-range ballistic missiles to Cuba in the summer of 1962, capable of striking major US cities. The discovery of these missiles led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the single most dangerous confrontation in human history, when the world stood at the absolute brink of nuclear war. The seemingly ridiculous plots involving exploding cigars and toxic wetsuits were not harmless stunts. They were the aggressive escalations that triggered the ultimate crisis, demonstrating that a series of desperate, poorly conceived spy operations could, in fact, directly push the world toward global annihilation. The strategic placement of Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba in the summer of 1962 remains the single most dangerous strategic maneuver of the Cold War, bringing the two nuclear superpowers into direct, eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation. This crisis, born directly from the American intelligence community's aggressive attempts at regime change in Cuba, dramatically redefined the stakes of the Shadow War. The primary Soviet motivation for deploying these missiles, codenamed Operation Anadir, was twofold: to protect the communist Cuban regime from further U.S. aggression following the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion and the constant threats of Operation Mongoose, and to rapidly redress the strategic nuclear imbalance. By 1962, the Soviet Union was acutely aware of its substantial deficit in deliverable ICBMs compared to the United States. Placing medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba capable of striking nearly every major U.S. city offered a cheap, quick, and highly effective way to achieve a terrifying parity. The United States, for its part, was conducting extensive high-altitude reconnaissance over Cuba, initially using U-2 aircraft to monitor Soviet military construction and the buildup of conventional forces. These intelligence flights were high-risk ventures, constantly under threat from Cuban and Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, yet the potential intelligence yield, verifying a direct existential threat, justified the risk. The initial photographic evidence was ambiguous, showing only construction sites and military activity. However, on October 14, 1962, a critical U-2 overflight, piloted by Major Richard Heiser, returned with undeniable photographic proof, clear images of Soviet missile sites being prepared for launch. These images, once analyzed by the CIA and presented to President John F. Kennedy, instantly confirmed the ultimate threat. The missiles were real, they were operational, and they represented an unacceptable shift in the balance of power, dramatically shortening the United States' warning time in the event of a nuclear strike from hours to mere minutes. The immediate consequence of this intelligence confirmation was the formation of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, tasked with formulating a response. The ensuing 13 days saw continuous, high-intensity intelligence gathering and diplomatic maneuvering. ExComm considered various military options, including an immediate airstrike on the missile sites or a full-scale invasion of Cuba, actions that the CIA had previously advocated. However, the intelligence gathered by the U-2 flights also revealed the presence of Soviet tactical nuclear weapons already in Cuba, a terrifying fact that made any preemptive conventional attack a near guarantee of a nuclear response against U.S. forces. The intelligence from the reconnaissance flights, therefore, became the single most important factor guiding the crisis. The photos not only revealed the threat, but also provided the necessary, precise information for the U.S. to select a non-military, graduated response, a naval quarantine, blockade of Cuba, designed to prevent the arrival of further offensive weapons without immediately escalating to an act of war. The entire crisis revolved around intelligence, acquiring it, confirming it, and using it to narrowly navigate the path away from nuclear exchange. The ultimate threat posed by the Cuban Missile Crisis was the stark realization that covert actions, Castro's defense strategy, and the U.S.'s espionage had finally crossed the line, placing the world on the knife's edge of global annihilation, a moment where the Shadow War almost became the final war.
The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis hinged upon the continuous, daring, and extremely high-risk intelligence operations carried out by the U.S. military, which provided President Kennedy with the real-time information necessary to sustain a diplomatic path and avoid a nuclear first strike. Once the initial U-2 photos confirmed the presence of the Soviet missiles, the intelligence imperative shifted from identification to continuous, low-level operational monitoring, a task far more dangerous than the high-altitude flights. The danger stemmed from the fact that Soviet air defenses in Cuba were now fully operational, and any further reconnaissance was considered a direct challenge. The U.S. launched extremely low-altitude RF-101 Voodoo and F-8U Crusader flights over the Cuban missile sites. Flying at treetop level and speeds approaching the speed of sound, these pilots faced a high probability of being shot down. Their mission was not merely photographic. They were gathering vital, real-time data on the operational status of the missiles, their readiness, their fueling status, and their guard strength. This low-level reconnaissance provided the necessary confirmation that the missiles were still being prepared for launch, but were not yet fully armed and ready, a narrow window of opportunity that allowed the U.S. to pursue the diplomatic option. The crisis reached its ultimate climax during the naval quarantine of Cuba. U.S. Navy ships operating under direct presidential orders were positioned to intercept Soviet vessels suspected of carrying further offensive weapons. This was a classic high-stakes espionage move dressed as a military maneuver. The intelligence agencies played a key role in identifying the specific Soviet ships, their cargo, and their probable intentions. The most immediate threat was the presence of Soviet submarines in the area, which the U.S. Navy, using its vast SOSUS network, was continuously tracking. The interactions between U.S. destroyers and Soviet nuclear-armed submarines, particularly the B-59, became one of the most perilous moments of the crisis. U.S. forces, attempting to force the B-59 to surface, dropped non-lethal depth charges. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the B-59's captain and political officer, isolated and fearing they were under attack, nearly authorized the launch of a nuclear torpedo, an act only prevented by the timely intervention of the flotilla's second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov. This event, hidden from the public for decades, demonstrated that the intelligence and military maneuvering on the brink of war were constantly risking inadvertent nuclear escalation. The diplomatic resolution, brokered by Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, was directly supported by the intelligence gathered throughout the crisis. The confirmation of the missile's capabilities and status, coupled with the pressure of the naval quarantine, allowed a strategic trade. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret U.S. agreement to remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The intelligence community's success in providing accurate, real-time information during those 13 days prevented the military from launching a potentially catastrophic preemptive strike. The crisis underscored the brutal reality of MAD. In the age of nuclear parity, the constant, aggressive intelligence probes, such as the assassination attempts on Castro and the U-2 flights, inevitably created an environment where one side felt compelled to risk everything. The low-level reconnaissance and the intelligence provided during the blockade were the fragile threads that pulled the world back from the ultimate brink.
By the early 1980s, the fragile détente that followed the Cuban Missile Crisis had completely evaporated, replaced by a climate of intense mutual hostility and escalating rhetoric, creating the deeply paranoid context for the Able Archer 83 incident. This period, driven by a renewed arms race and aggressive political posturing, led the world into a state of heightened alert that was dangerously close to the brink of accidental war. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 marked a fundamental shift in U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union, moving away from containment and toward direct confrontation. Reagan famously referred to the USSR as the evil empire and embarked on a massive, ambitious military buildup, symbolized by the proposal of the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, quickly dubbed Star Wars. SDI, a conceptual space-based anti-missile system, was viewed by Moscow not as a defensive shield, but as a direct threat that would neutralize the Soviet retaliatory capacity, thereby destroying the foundation of mutually assured destruction and making a U.S. first strike plausible. This technological escalation, coupled with aggressive political actions, such as the deployment of new intermediate-range nuclear missiles, Pershing II, and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe, convinced the Soviet leadership that the U.S. was genuinely preparing for a nuclear first strike. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, the KGB and the GRU, launched Operation RYAN,
an acronym for a Russian phrase meaning nuclear missile attack, a massive, high-priority program aimed at detecting any unusual activity, political or military, that might signal an imminent nuclear attack by the US and NATO. The Soviet perception was rooted in genuine fear, believing that the American military exercises and technological advancements were not mere deterrents, but preparations for a preemptive war. The extreme paranoia within the Kremlin was amplified by the Soviet leadership's advanced age and dogmatic worldview, which viewed the US through a lens of deep ideological mistrust. The year 1983 was particularly tense. The Soviet shootdown of Korean Airlines Flight 007, KAL-007, in September, after it strayed into Soviet airspace, demonstrated the hair-trigger readiness of Soviet forces and led to a global diplomatic outcry. Just 2 months later, NATO was scheduled to conduct Able Archer 83, a routine command and control exercise. Given the already toxic atmosphere, the US and NATO failed to adequately consider how the exercise's exceptionally realistic nature, which included simulating nuclear release procedures involving heads of government and operating under a new secure communication system, would be interpreted by the hyper-vigilant Soviet intelligence agencies. The stage was set for the ultimate miscalculation. The US intelligence community, blinded by its own confidence in the exercise's defensive nature, failed to grasp the depth of Soviet paranoia or the intensity of the RYAN program. The consequence of this failure to understand the enemy's fear was that a routine, rehearsed military exercise would soon be interpreted by the Soviet command structure as the final, irreversible step toward a real nuclear launch, leading to perhaps the closest the world has ever come to an accidental, system-generated nuclear war. The deterioration of relations and the escalation of arms in the early 1980s created the zero-sum context where even an exercise could be mistaken for an attack.
The Able Archer 83 exercise, conducted by NATO in November 1983, was ostensibly a routine command and control drill, yet its unprecedented realism, coupled with the extreme paranoia of the Soviet leadership, led the Soviet Union to genuinely believe it was a sophisticated deception operation masking a genuine nuclear first strike. This moment is now widely considered one of the most perilous close calls of the entire Cold War. Able Archer 83 simulated the escalation of a conventional war in Europe into a full-scale nuclear conflict. The exercise was designed to be highly realistic, involving key Allied political leaders, a new and secure communication system, and a simulation of the transition from conventional defense to the ultimate act of war, the release of nuclear weapons. Crucially, the simulation used a unique system of radio silence breaks and coded messages that the Soviets, monitoring the activity through their RYAN program, viewed as a sudden and inexplicable shift from routine to genuine war footing. Because the Soviet intelligence agencies had been instructed to look for signs of a surprise attack, the specific actions of Able Archer 83, such as the participation of heads of government, the heightened alert status of US military bases, and the simulated nuclear release procedures were misinterpreted as definitive proof of imminent hostility. The KGB and GRU reported back to Moscow that the exercise was, in all probability, a cover for an actual orchestrated nuclear launch by the United States. This intelligence assessment triggered a terrifying, unacknowledged response within the Soviet Union. Believing they were facing their final hours before a decapitating first strike, Soviet military units, including tactical nuclear missile squadrons and air defense forces in East Germany and Poland, were placed on high alert. Some Soviet fighter jets loaded with nuclear warheads were reportedly put on runway alert,
prepared to launch a preemptive strike if further unambiguous signs of an American attack were detected. The Soviet command structure's deep-seated fear of a surprise attack, a historical trauma dating back to the Nazi invasion, meant they were operating on a hair-trigger alert, ready to launch their own nuclear missiles rather than absorb a first strike. The world was saved by a confluence of factors, including the skepticism of a few key Soviet intelligence officers on the ground, notably KGB Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Gordievsky, a double agent, who understood the political context and reported to Moscow that the exercise appeared to be exactly that, an exercise. Furthermore, the slow, methodical nature of the NATO exercise itself failed to fully match the anticipated speed of a real attack, giving a few crucial voices time to argue for restraint. Following the incident, the intelligence community slowly realized the extent of the Soviet misinterpretation. Classified post-mortem reports confirmed that the Soviets genuinely believed they were under imminent threat, a realization that shocked Western leaders and led to a permanent revision of how military exercises were conducted. The Able Archer 83 incident was not caused by Soviet aggression, but by American intelligence failure, a failure to understand the profound paranoia of the enemy and the specific cues that would trigger a retaliatory launch. This wargame demonstrated that in the age of MAD, the greatest threat was not intentional aggression, but the tragic system-wide misreading of intentions, bringing the world closer to accidental annihilation than perhaps any other single event.
The relentless pressure to acquire intelligence on the Soviet Union and its satellite states drove the CIA to pursue increasingly unconventional, bizarre, and technologically desperate measures, often pushing the boundaries of what was considered feasible or even sane. The intelligence gap was seen as an existential threat, justifying a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks approach to surveillance innovation, leading to some of the most infamous and ridiculous spy projects in history. One key area of desperation was the need for covert audio surveillance in high-risk urban environments, particularly in and around Soviet embassy compounds. Agents could not always get close enough to plant traditional bugs, and existing technology was often too bulky or unreliable. This challenge led to the conception of Project Acoustic Kitty, an operation so absurd it defies the serious nature of the Cold War. The theory was simple. What if a common, seemingly innocuous animal could be turned into a listening device? The CIA dedicated considerable resources, estimated to be around $20 million, to surgically implanting communication equipment into a living cat. The cat was chosen for its ability to roam freely and unnoticed around Soviet compounds. The device involved surgically inserting a microphone into the cat's ear canal, a small radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and a thin wire antenna woven into its tail fur. A small battery pack was placed in its chest. The cat was essentially transformed into a mobile, biological bugging device. The objective was to use the cat to passively eavesdrop on conversations between Soviet agents in parks or near target buildings. Beyond the feline spy, the CIA explored numerous other outlandish bio- and mech-based surveillance concepts. This included developing specialized insect-like drones for photographic reconnaissance, and even attempting to weaponize biological agents in assassination plots, such as the infamous toxic cigar attempts on Fidel Castro. The underlying principle was a profound belief in the power of technological asymmetry. If the US could develop surveillance methods so unique and unexpected that the Soviets couldn't even conceive of them, they would gain an invaluable, uncounterable intelligence edge.
The sheer desperation driving these projects was rooted in the paranoia surrounding the missile gap and the fear of a Soviet technological leap. The intelligence community felt they could not afford to dismiss any idea, no matter how ridiculous, if it offered even a slight chance of penetrating the Iron Curtain's formidable security apparatus. The pursuit of Acoustic Kitty, for instance, demonstrated a deep commitment to finding a way to breach Soviet physical security, even at the cost of humane treatment and immense budgetary waste. While many of these projects, including the Feline Spy, ultimately failed spectacularly, they collectively illustrate the immense pressure placed on CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. The Cold War demanded constant innovation, leading to a period where the line between serious intelligence gathering and pure science fiction was constantly blurred, resulting in covert operations that were as crazy as they were expensive, underscoring the lengths to which both sides would go to gain a marginal advantage in the Shadow War.
Project Acoustic Kitty, while a fascinating example of Cold War technological desperation, culminated in one of the most famous and humiliating failures in CIA history, demonstrating the inherent limitations of attempting to weaponize biology and the immense folly of unchecked intelligence ambition. The concept, a surgically implanted audio surveillance device within a house cat, was fundamentally flawed by the insurmountable problem of feline autonomy and behavioral unpredictability. The CIA's scientists and engineers spent years and millions of dollars perfecting the implantation of the microphone, transmitter, and battery pack. The technical objective, creating a discrete, functioning listening device, was largely achieved. The device worked, but the biological component, the cat, did not function as an obedience surveillance asset. The immediate operational failure of Acoustic Kitty became the stuff of intelligence legend. During the cat's first field test, released near a park bench where two Soviet agents were scheduled to meet, the animal was supposed to walk toward the agents and linger long enough for the conversation to be recorded. Instead, the cat wandered into the street and was immediately struck and killed by a passing taxi. The entire mission, along with the several $million invested, ended in a tragicomic instant of traffic accident. Subsequent, less documented tests also failed due to the cat's complete lack of interest in espionage. Cats proved entirely uncontrollable. They would frequently wander off mission, chase mice, or simply sit still and groom themselves, generating only the sound of purring and licking, rendering the expensive surveillance equipment completely useless for capturing human conversation. The CIA eventually concluded that the difficulty of training the cat to perform the required surveillance tasks, namely, walking a straight line toward a target and staying within range, was too high to overcome. The fundamental nature of the animal was incompatible with the demands of a controlled, covert operation. In 1967, the project was officially deemed a failure and canceled. A declassified memo on the project's conclusion succinctly and humorously summarized the technical success and operational failure, noting that while the technical requirements were met, the environmental and behavioral factors were too complex. The report highlighted the difficulty in controlling the cat's attention span and its lack of motivation to follow instructions. Project Acoustic Kitty is more than a funny historical anecdote. It is a critical case study in Cold War overreach. It illustrates the dangers of the science-first, feasibility-second mentality that often plagues highly secretive, generously funded government projects during a period of intense ideological pressure. The obsession with gaining a technological edge over the Soviets led the agency to invest millions in a fundamentally flawed concept, diverting resources from more practical and effective intelligence-gathering methods. The farcical failure underscores the crucial tension in Cold War espionage. The pursuit of the perfect, impossible spy gadget sometimes resulted in the most embarrassing, spectacular intelligence failures. The ultimate lesson of the cat, the transmitter, and the taxi
is that the complex, unpredictable nature of the real world, represented by a simple passing vehicle, was often the greatest vulnerability in the most elaborate and secret spy schemes, even those aimed at the highest strategic targets.
The extreme and shocking plan, known as Operation Northwood, which proposed staging acts of terrorism on American soil and blaming them on the Cuban regime, emerged from the most intense and paranoid period of U.S.-Cuba relations in the early 1960s. The plan was conceived in the immediate aftermath of the Bay of Pigs disaster and before the Cuban Missile Crisis, a period defined by the U.S. military and intelligence community's desperate, single-minded quest to find a viable justification for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. The context for Northwood was the profound humiliation and strategic frustration felt by the U.S. government and military establishment after the failed 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. The invasion's failure was a massive political and military defeat for the Kennedy administration and confirmed Fidel Castro's iron grip on power. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest level of military leadership, felt strongly that Cuba posed an intolerable national security threat and that a direct, unmitigated military intervention was the only viable way to remove Castro and eliminate the Soviet bridgehead in the Caribbean. However, President Kennedy was hesitant to authorize an outright, unprovoked invasion, understanding the catastrophic political and military risks, particularly the potential Soviet retaliation in Berlin or another European hotspot. The U.S. military establishment, frustrated by this political restraint, sought to create a pretext, a clear, undeniable provocation that would shock the American public and the international community, thereby generating the moral and political justification necessary for a massive military invasion without the need for presidential authorization. This pursuit of a pretext led to the drafting of Operation Northwood in early 1962 by the Joint Chiefs of Staff under the direct authority of Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer. The plan was an attempt to provide the president with a menu of manufactured provocations. The rationale was simple: create an act of aggression so egregious that Kennedy would have no political choice but to approve the invasion the JCS desperately desired. The operation was rooted in a cynical, terrifying disregard for human life and democratic principles. The JCS was not proposing to retaliate against a Cuban act of aggression. They were proposing to create one. This institutional willingness to fabricate military justification underscored the extreme ideological rigidity and operational desperation that pervaded the military intelligence establishment during this period of Cold War panic. The entire operation was conceived in a desperate attempt to manipulate the democratic process and force a declaration of war. The context of U.S.-Cuba tensions, the fear of communism 90 miles from shore, the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, and the strategic presence of the Soviet Union created an environment where even the nation's top military leaders felt justified in proposing acts of terrorism against their own population to achieve a desired political end. The Northwood proposal was the ultimate expression of the Cold War's extreme paranoia, where the ends of ideological victory were seen to justify the most immoral and criminal means.
Operation Northwood was not merely a set of aggressive contingency plans. It was a formal proposal by the Joint Chiefs of Staff outlining specific, heinous acts of state-sponsored domestic terrorism designed to be blamed on the Cuban regime.
The detailed, shocking nature of the plan remains the most extreme example of Cold War immorality and the willingness of the military establishment to risk catastrophic escalation. The Northwood proposal contained several distinct options for manufactured provocations, all sharing the common goal of creating American casualties to generate public and international support for war. The most notorious element was the proposal to stage the simulated sinking of a U.S. Navy vessel, specifically the plan to orchestrate an attack on a boat or ship carrying Cuban refugees en route to the United States. The proposal was chillingly specific. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba, or even worse, develop a Cuban communist terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be directed against Cuban refugees seeking a haven in the United States. The plan also detailed the possibility of faking the shooting down of a civilian aircraft. The JCS proposed taking a U.S. military plane and repainting it to look like a Cuban MiG fighter. This fake MiG would then attack a civilian charter plane flying from the U.S. to South America. To ensure the provocation was effective and the U.S. government was protected from exposure, the plan suggested the civilian plane be replaced with an identical, unmanned drone during the critical stage of the attack, ensuring the passengers were safe. However, other iterations of the plan were less concerned with civilian safety. The overarching objective was to create a scenario, a bombing, a shooting, a sinking, that would result in the deaths of innocent American citizens, which could then be publicly and unequivocally blamed on Fidel Castro and his communist regime. The political fallout from such an event would, the JCS believed, provide President Kennedy with a mandate for immediate, full-scale military invasion. President Kennedy, to his immense credit, categorically rejected Operation Northwood. His refusal was a critical act of moral and political judgment that prevented the U.S. from engaging in an act of state terrorism that would have profoundly disgraced the nation and fundamentally undermined the democratic principles it was ostensibly fighting to protect. The immediate consequence of the rejection was a political and ideological rift between the civilian government and its top military brass. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was reportedly furious over the rejection and soon found himself marginalized by the Kennedy administration. The revelation of the Northwood proposal in the late 1990s through declassified documents confirmed the darkest suspicions about the Cold War. It showed that the military and intelligence establishments were not only willing to engage in extreme covert operations abroad, but were prepared to commit acts of terrorism against their own citizens to achieve a desired policy outcome. The plan, though never executed, stands as a terrifying example of how close the U.S. came to manufacturing a justification for a major war, an action that would have involved a full-scale invasion of Cuba and risked a direct, catastrophic military response from the Soviet Union, bringing the world to a manufactured rather than accidental brink of World War III.
The Cold War was not confined to the superpowers. It spilled into every corner of the globe, including the volatile Korean Peninsula, leading to the highly controversial and escalatory operation involving the USS Pueblo. This operation highlights the critical shift in espionage toward electronic intelligence, ELINT, gathering, and the high-stakes risks of operating surveillance platforms in contested international waters, a practice that directly contributed to one of the most serious post-Cuban Missile Crisis diplomatic confrontations. By the mid-1960s, the U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, relied heavily on specialized intelligence ships, modified naval vessels equipped with sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment to patrol international waters and intercept military communications from Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean targets. The USS Pueblo was one such ship, technically a light cargo vessel converted into a massive floating listening post. Its primary mission was to sail just outside the 12-mile territorial limit claimed by North Korea and collect ELINT, intercepting high-frequency radio transmissions, decoding radar signals, and analyzing communication patterns of the North Korean People's Army, KPA, and the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The intelligence gained from these ELINT operations was vital for building a comprehensive electronic profile of enemy forces, understanding their command and control capabilities, and preparing for any potential military action. This electronic espionage was considered a non-violent, necessary component of deterrence. However, the operational reality of the Pueblo's mission was dangerously risky. The ship was lightly armed and slow, making it highly vulnerable to military interception. Furthermore, the precise legal boundaries of international waters were constantly contested by North Korea, which maintained an aggressive stance against any foreign surveillance activity near its coast. The decision to send the Pueblo into such a volatile, hostile area was a massive intelligence gamble, prioritizing the collection of critical ELINT over the safety of the crew and the potential for a severe international incident. The U.S. intelligence community desperately needed to understand North Korea's military posture, especially given the simmering tensions between the two Koreas and the ever-present shadow of Soviet and Chinese involvement. The Pueblo's mission was directly authorized at the highest levels, underscoring the perceived value of the electronic intelligence it could collect. The risk-reward calculation, however, was disastrously flawed. The intelligence community underestimated the North Korean regime's willingness to engage in a direct military response to perceived espionage. The U.S. government had grown accustomed to the practice of ELINT gathering being a tense but ultimately tolerated activity in international waters. This complacency led to the exposure of the Pueblo to the full force of a highly militarized and unpredictable state. The operation, a routine spy mission in the context of the Cold War's electronic frontier, would soon turn into a hostile act of capture, humiliation, and a nearly catastrophic international crisis, demonstrating that even non-violent electronic espionage could instantly trigger a military response with global implications.
The inherent risk of the electronic espionage operation culminated in the capture of the USS Pueblo by North Korean forces on January 23, 1968, an event that instantly triggered a major diplomatic and military crisis that brought the U.S. perilously close to launching a retaliatory strike. The incident exposed the extreme vulnerabilities of the U.S. intelligence gathering methods and the unpredictability of the Cold War's smaller players. While operating in international waters according to U.S. coordinates, the Pueblo was challenged, attacked, and ultimately boarded by North Korean patrol boats. The Pueblo's commander, Lloyd Butcher, lacked the armament or speed to escape, and under orders not to provoke a wider engagement, the crew was forced to surrender. The capture of the vessel was a massive intelligence coup for North Korea and the Soviet bloc. The ship contained vast amounts of highly classified electronic intelligence equipment and, most critically, thousands of pages of secret documents, including detailed U.S. naval codes and operating procedures. The crew's immediate failure to fully destroy this classified material before capture resulted in a catastrophic intelligence loss for the U.S. The immediate response from the U.S. government was an intense military mobilization. President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration was deeply humiliated and faced immense political pressure to retrieve the ship and crew by force. The U.S. Navy ordered a massive deployment of air and naval assets to the area, including the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, in what was seen as a clear prelude to a military engagement. The crisis quickly escalated, forcing the U.S. to choose between a humiliating diplomatic negotiation and a dangerous military confrontation that risked engaging North Korean, Chinese, and potentially Soviet forces, thereby widening the Vietnam War into a much larger Asian conflict. The North Korean regime, utilizing the captive crew for maximum propaganda, demanded an admission of guilt. Commander Bulge and his crew, subjected to months of brutal captivity and torture, were eventually forced to sign a prepared confession admitting the Pueblo had violated North Korean territorial waters and engaged in espionage. Bulge famously signed the document using a double entendre, signing, "I solemnly swear before the KPA, North Korean People's Army, that I have lied to you," a reference to the word lie as a joke. But the forced public confession was a devastating political blow to the U.S. The crisis was ultimately resolved through 11 months of tense, grueling diplomatic negotiations. The U.S. was forced to sign a written statement acknowledging that the Pueblo had illegally intruded into North Korean waters, an admission the U.S. immediately repudiated after the crew's release. On December 23, 1968, the 82 surviving crew members were released, though the Pueblo remains in North Korean possession as a floating museum of American military defeat. The Pueblo incident stands as a powerful testament to the extreme dangers of the electronic frontier. It proved that nonviolent espionage could provoke a military response, forcing the U.S. into a humiliating no-win scenario. The crisis was a clear example of how close a minor intelligence operation could bring the world to a major war, demonstrating that the shadow conflict was being fought with deadly seriousness by every nation, regardless of its size or power, often threatening to unleash the full force of the major powers into an unwanted larger conflict. We have peeled back the secrecy on 10 of the most insane, risky operations of the Cold War, from the bizarre brilliance of Project Azorian to the terrifying blunder of Able Archer 83. These stories confirm that World War III was prevented not by perfect political systems, but by the thin thread of human restraint and sheer luck. The most dangerous game ever played was the one fought in the dark, where a fake weather balloon, a submerged submarine, or a command simulation could have ended civilization. The Shadow War is over, but the lessons of miscalculation, overreach, and technological hubris endure. Which one of these 10 operations, Azorian, U-2, Gold, Mongoose, Cuban Missile Reconnaissance, Able Archer 83, Acoustic Kitty, Northwood, or Pueblo, do you believe was the most morally bankrupt, and which was the closest call to the brink of nuclear war? Share your analysis in the comments below, and subscribe as we continue to shine a light on the darkest chapters of history and the constant, high-stakes battle for intelligence. The secrets of the past hold the key to understanding the future.